Muy buenos días a todos. Aquí en Colombia, nuestro saludo de buenos días. Las personas que nos acompañan desde Japón, nuestras buenas noches y nuestros agradecimientos por estar con nosotros en este momento. Mi nombre es Oscar Romero, soy el director ejecutivo de la Cámara Colombo-Japonesa y me ha correspondido a mí el honor de dar inicio a este importante evento. Evento que nos reúne hoy para conocer y repasar de primera mano lo que hemos denominado la estrategia comercial de Japón en una economía mundial turbulenta y las relaciones Japón-Colombia, potenciando la Asociación Económica Japón-Colombia. Sea la oportunidad para agradecer a la Cancillería de Colombia, a la Embajada del Japón en Colombia y al Centro del Japón, con quien hemos unido esfuerzos para poder tener hoy tanto al profesor Watanabe como al profesor Matsui desde Japón. A ellos nuestro agradecimiento y nuevamente buenas noches para ellos. Recuerdo que en septiembre de 2019 habíamos contado con la presencia en nuestro país del profesor Watanabe y en esa ocasión nos habló de la estrategia comercial de Japón en una economía mundial en problemas y las relaciones entre Japón y Colombia. Por lo tanto, mis agradecimientos al profesor. Nuestra entidad como Cámara, y como su nombre lo indica, busca mejorar las relaciones de comercio e industria entre nuestros dos países y desde su fundación en el año 88 ha logrado que cada año estas relaciones crezcan y se solidifiquen. Con eventos como el de hoy tratamos de darle una mayor visibilidad a Japón, que sin duda es un socio estratégico para Colombia y en los más de 110 años de esas relaciones siempre ha estado compartiendo con nosotros no solo su conocimiento, sino su ejemplo y su cultura. En la actualidad tenemos presencia de empresas japonesas en 21 sectores de nuestra economía y esperamos que esa presencia se siga aumentando. Sabemos que el camino no es fácil, pero con eventos como el de hoy, esa presencia seguirá aumentando. No tan rápido como quisiéramos, pero sí con paso firme y sobre todo sin descanso. Después de este breve saludo, doy la palabra al señor consejero Hiroaki Kodama de la Embajada del Japón en Colombia, quienes, como lo mencioné, fueron parte fundamental para hacer realidad este evento. Señor Kodama, buenos días y siga, por favor.
Buenos días, gracias por presentarme. Y bueno, ahora de aquí adelante voy a hablar en inglés. Thank you very much for presenting me in this occasion. So I would like to deliver a few words. So dear Professor Watanabe Yorizumi and Professor Matsui Kenichiro, good evening to both of you in Japan. Well, dear attendees, good morning. Well, welcome to the lecture, Entry of Latin American Countries into the World Economy and the Role of Japan, given by Dr. Watanabe Yorizumi, a professor at Kansai University of International Studies and a professor emeritus at Keio University, with some comments by Dr. Matsui Kenichiro, expert in international markets, new currencies, and the financial markets in the Latin American region from Takushoku University. First of all, I would like to thank the Colombian-Japanese Chamber of Commerce and Industry, especially Mr. Oscar Romero, Executive Director of this entity, and who assists us as Master of Commerce, Master of Ceremony of this conference, as well as the Japan Center of the University of Los Andes for their support in organizing this conference, an event that is part of the academic agenda of the Cathedral Japón initiative. I also deeply appreciate the participation of Mr. Jean-Marie Chenu, Associate Professor of the Department of Political Science and Global Studies at the University of Los Andes. It is always a pleasure to have the support of Los Andes professors, as it allows us to strengthen our academic relations with such prestigious institutions as this university. I also extend my thanks to Dr. Watanabe Yorizumi and Dr. Matsui Kenichiro for sharing their views on the international economy, particularly on the economy of Latin American countries and Japan's role in this global context. I invite all attendees to actively participate through their questions and comments so that we can further enrich this conference. Finally, I would like to thank the Vice President and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Colombia, Dr. Marta Lucia Ramirez, who extended us an invitation to work together and hold the Cathedral Japón. This initiative allows the creation of academic and the cultural agenda with topics as diverse as diplomacy, cinema, art, and international economy. The Cathedral Japón made it possible to present aspects of Japan from various perspectives to make visible the work of Japan in Latin American countries, especially Colombia, and to strengthen the relations of friendship and the cooperation between our countries. With the conference, we terminate our participation in this Cathedral Japón. For us, it is very valuable to continue bringing Japan closer to all of you. So I look forward to seeing you in future activities of the Embassy of Japan in Colombia and the Japan Center of the University of Los Andes and the Colombian Japanese Chamber of Commerce Industry. Thank you very much for your attention.
Señor Kodama, muchas gracias por sus palabras y nuestros agradecimientos también a la Embajada del Japón por haber hecho posible este evento. Bueno, muy bien. Entonces ahora le voy a dar la palabra al señor Jean-Marie Chenou, que es el profesor asociado del Departamento de Ciencias Políticas y Estudios Globales de la Universidad de los Andes, quien se dirigirá a ustedes. Entonces, profesor, adelante, por favor.
Muchísimas gracias a la Embajada del Japón en Colombia, a la Cámara Colombo-Japonesa de Comercio e Industria, a la Cancillería de Colombia y al Centro del Japón de la Universidad de los Andes por la organización de esta conferencia. Muchas gracias obviamente al profesor Watanabe y al profesor Matsui por su presencia. En nombre de la Universidad de los Andes y del nuevo pregrado en Estudios Globales, es un placer y un honor de contar con la presencia de esos conferencistas y de poder participar en este evento. Hubo mucho interés en los estudiantes por ese evento y creo que tenemos muchos estudiantes de la universidad conectados hoy, entonces es realmente un placer poder participar. Colombia ha empezado desde los años 90 un proceso activo de inserción en los flujos globales, ya sean económicos, políticos o culturales. Y desde los años 2000 hay un intento de diversificación más allá de la relación especial que tiene Colombia con Estados Unidos. La región Asia-Pacífico obviamente es uno de los focos hacia los cuales Colombia se está tratando de insertar. Y eso se evidencia con la creación y la participación activa de Colombia en la creación de la Alianza del Pacífico, también con la firma de tratados de libre comercio con diferentes países asiáticos. Lo que queremos hacer en la Universidad de los Andes y con este nuevo pregrado en estudios globales es formar profesionales para este nuevo mundo en el que Colombia va a jugar un papel mucho más activo. Entonces queremos que las y los estudiantes aprendan de diferentes disciplinas, la economía, el derecho, la ciencia política, las relaciones internacionales, pero también hay un enfoque particular en el aprendizaje de los idiomas, de las lenguas extranjeras. Japonés es uno de los idiomas que se enseña aquí en la universidad. Además de los idiomas, también queremos que las y los estudiantes aprendan de las culturas, de la participación de los países, de los diferentes países del mundo en la economía global. Entonces, realmente esta conferencia va muy de la mano de la creación de este pregrado en estudios globales. Estamos muy felices de tenerlos acá y muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, profesor Chenou, por sus palabras y por igual servirnos de anfitrión en esta ocasión. Muy bien, entonces, antes de dar la palabra al profesor Watanabe, quisiera hacer una breve presentación tanto de él como del profesor Matsui, quien nos dará a conocer sus comentarios luego de la presentación del profesor Watanabe. Entonces les comento, el profesor Yorizumi Watanabe es profesor de Economía Política Internacional y decano de la Facultad de Comunicación Internacional de la Universidad de Estudios Internacionales de Kansai desde abril de 2019, y también es profesor emérito de la Universidad de Keio, donde enseñó desde abril de 2005 hasta marzo de 2019. En su distinguida carrera ha tenido una importante participación en las principales negociaciones comerciales bilaterales y multilaterales en las que Japón ha participado en las últimas 2 décadas. Esto incluye, por ejemplo, puestos en las misiones diplomáticas de Japón en Ginebra, en Bruselas, fue director general adjunto de la Oficina de Asuntos Económicos del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores de Japón entre 2002 y 2004, y ocupó el cargo de negociador jefe del Acuerdo de Asociación Económica entre Japón y México y del Grupo de Trabajo sobre la adhesión de Rusia a la Organización Mundial del Comercio. Fue asistente especial del ministro de Asuntos Exteriores de Japón en 2004, ha sido miembro de algunos grupos de trabajo, como el del EPA entre Japón y la Unión Europea, así como el del EPA entre Japón y la India, y más recientemente el Grupo para las Relaciones Económicas entre Japón y Estados Unidos. Estuvo a cargo del Ministerio, este grupo de trabajo a cargo del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores de Japón en 2016. Actualmente el profesor Watanabe forma parte del panel sobre cuestiones relacionadas con el Brexit, organizado por la Keidan-REM, que es la Federación Japonesa de Organizaciones Económicas. Y desde abril de 2015 es auditor de cuentas en Mitsubishi Fuso y compañía que está afiliada al grupo Daimler. Por su parte, el profesor Kenichiro Matsui es profesor de la Facultad de Ciencias Económicas y Políticas de la Universidad de Takuchoku desde 2013, doctor en Políticas Públicas y Medios de Comunicación de la Universidad de Keio. En el ámbito laboral, el profesor Matsui trabajó en el Banco Mitsubishi, actualmente el Banco de Tokio Mitsubishi UFJ, en el que ganó una amplia experiencia en el área de mercado internacional en secciones como la Dirección de Proyectos Internacionales, la Dirección de América Latina, la Dirección de Auditoría Internacional y la Dirección de Proyectos Globales, entre otras. Desde el banco también ejerció cargos en el extranjero. Trabajó en la Embajada del Japón en Francia como parte de la negociación del plan de gestión de las deudas públicas, en el Japan International Cooperation System para la ejecución del apoyo oficial de desarrollo, que se traduce como ODA, del Japón, y en el Institute for International Monetary Affairs, como parte de la investigación sobre la moneda y el mercado financiero de los países emergentes. Actualmente concentra sus investigaciones en el área de las nuevas monedas y el mercado financiero en la región de Latinoamérica, concretamente en los problemas de legalizar el Bitcoin como curso legal en El Salvador. Entonces, vamos a comenzar formalmente la presentación del profesor Watanabe, nuevamente agradeciéndole por su presencia en esta reunión. Entonces, profesor Watanabe, buenas noches para usted en Japón y bienvenido. Adelante, por favor.
Muchísimas gracias, señor Oscar Romero. It is a great honor and a pleasure for me to be with you here. Ladies and gentlemen, all the friends there, and also the people at the Chamber of Commerce of Colombia, the colleagues from Universidad de Los Andes. I'm extremely delighted to be with you today, although it is rather late. In Japan, it's almost 10 p.m., but it may be a little too early for you to start the day because it should be very early in the morning. So the thing that I could share with you is maybe coffee, Colombian coffee, just to keep me awake and keep you awake. Having said that, yes, I am given about 60 minutes to go to speak about Japan's trade strategy in troubled world economy. On the basis of that, I could extend my talks to touch upon Japan-Colombia relations. I hope that you can see my presentation materials, if that's okay. I see Jean-Marie Chenou. He is nodding like this. It means that should be okay. Jean-Marie, vous êtes français?
Oui, exactement.
Ah oui, c'est ça. Parce que si c'est en français, ça me fait plaisir de parler en français, mais malheureusement, je ne parle pas tellement bien en espagnol. Donc, avec votre permission, je voudrais commencer en anglais. Merci beaucoup.
D'accord.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the next slide that I'd like to show you, oh, it doesn't progress. Oh, excuse me, just, sorry, maybe I have to start it all over again to share the document. Would you please be patient for a while? Okay. Oh yes, this one here. How about this? Oh, this one is better, perhaps. Yes. Okay. Right. So now you can show, you can share the presentation material with me. Then I'd like to move on to the menu du jour, today's content, starting from introduction, which might be a little lengthy, then move on to the basic characteristics of Japanese FTA policy. We call that economic partnership agreement, which goes beyond the scope of conventional free trade agreement, and also the mega FTAs, the FTAs across different regions, inter-regional FTAs that we call that mega FTAs, and then the relationship between Japan and Colombia, and how does Japan deal with uncertainties and sort of quest of Japan to bring positive solution to the present circumstances, which is quite filled a lot of uncertainties. And then that will bring us all to the concluding part. First of all, introductions. Here I'd like to touch upon the major uncertainties in the world economy, threefold. First, US-China trade conflict, then COVID-19, and most recently, the war in Ukraine. So let me touch with the first two of the major sources of uncertainty and pre-COVID-19. One is Brexit and the other was Trump shock. Let me briefly touch upon that. Mr. Trump, he was ex-president of the United States, and he put the protectionism at heart of U.S. economic policy, and not only to China, but also to other countries, including countries that normally people consider alliance to United States, the allies of United States, such as EU member countries, and also Japan, Mexico, Korea, and so forth. He had also very significant kind of promise during his campaign that he wanted to withdraw United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. We call that TPP, which was agreed upon in October 2015. That was already agreed upon before Mr. Trump came into power, but he didn't like TPP at all, and he didn't like NAFTA either, North American Free Trade Agreement. So he didn't like that kind of free trade architectures, and he actually stepped forward to withdraw the United States from the TPP as one of the first promise that he has honored immediately after he became into power, into the White House. That was on 23rd January 2017. And also he wanted to change NAFTA, and he did that. So NAFTA was North American Free Trade Agreement, and it was maybe the best sort of model of free trade agreement. But now replacing NAFTA with USMCA. USMCA stands for United States, Mexico, Canada agreement. And USMCA, obviously, there's no free element in it, unlike the NAFTA. So USMCA is very much kind of, I would say, managed trade arrangement. So you see, he changed NAFTA, and also Mr. Trump didn't like the free trade with Europe either. So actually, during the Obama administration, there was a discussion between Europe and United States, the freer trade and freer flow of investment under the framework of TTIP. And the TTIP stands for trade and, well, it's trade transatlantic trade and investment partnership. TTIP is certainly sister to TPP, which is across the Pacific. So you see the TTIP, of course, very much condemned by Trump administration, and one of the closest advisors to Mr. Trump, Mr. Peter Navarro, he said that Germany was one of the main barriers to U.S. trade deal with the EU, and he just declared that the TTIP has been dead already. So you see, that's the beginning of Trump administration. But it seems that Mr. Biden's administration, now we have since last year, Mr. Biden's administration does not really make any clear sort of change in terms of international trade policies. Other things like Iran nuclear deal, other things like that, or the coming back to the Paris agreement on CO2 emission problems. Those two issues, Mr. Biden changed the course of United States. But as far as trade is concerned, Mr. Biden's administration has been taking also rather, conservative attitude. And for instance, its attitude toward China has not been really altered. It's not been changed. So that's the situation of protectionism coming from Washington, D.C. That affected enormously, particularly in the global value chain has been very much disrupted by such America First type protectionism, and also the U.S.-China trade row also quite upset the whole global value chain, and more than 60% of Japanese companies, they feel that they are very much threatened by this kind of disruption of global value chain, and they have to change their procurement policies of parts and components, be it in auto industries, be it in electronic industries. So that's really the situation where we are in now. And Trump opted for bilateral trade deals, and he gave very little sort of consideration to multilateral trading system embodied in the WTO. That has also quite a catastrophic sort of consequences in the sound management of international trade. All multilateral trade embodied in the WTO. That was also a quite worrisome situation, and the WTO system as such has been still in a very difficult situation. And bilateral deals or regional deals have been replacing the importance of trade multilateralism embodied in the WTO. So that's a situation is stemming out from Mr. Trump's America First type of trade protectionism. The other source of concern, that was Brexit, and Brexit has been done already. It was in the year 2020, January 31st. Finally, United Kingdom left European Union following the national referendum in Great Britain in June 2016. So it's a long time of discussions, but that had also quite significant influence and ramifications to the rest of the world. And Japanese companies have been also quite adversely affected by the Brexit. And as you see, the many Japanese companies have been stationed in United Kingdom. And why Brexit matters? Because those Japanese companies are engaged very actively in the local productions in United Kingdom. That started all over from the mid of 1980s when Madame Thatcher was British Prime Minister. And she invited Japanese companies into UK. And as you see, starting from Toyota, Sony, Nissan, Canon, all these companies largely invested in the UK and providing a lot of jobs there. And the reason why Japanese companies so much interested in investing in the UK, that was, you see, the products made in UK could be considered as made in UK, meaning, the made in European Union, so that they can avoid the duties imposed if the products are entering into the territory of European Union market. There should be very high duties imposed on Japanese products if they are produced in Japan. But if they are produced in UK, since UK was a member to the European Union, so that they could avoid the duties imposed on those Japanese products made in UK. And that was the chief reason why so many Japanese companies went to UK. So very fact that UK has left the European Union, that was a really the large headache it's a big headache for Japanese companies. Now we have the EU-Japan EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement. In addition to that, we have Japan-UK EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement. So I think the situation is more or less well taken care. But of course, the Brexit still, affecting adversely the Japanese operations in the UK, and that is still kind of lingering problem. So I just cited what happened if the UK failed to keep free market access to the EU single market. Now it's more or less settled, because now European Union agreed an FTA with United Kingdom. So, but still, there is a border controls. So the transaction cost is larger now than before. So all these things was the the source of concern for Japanese companies, source of uncertainties. And next slide, I want to just share with you the how extensive Japanese presence or presence of Japanese companies in Europe. You see, they are so much engaged in the local productions, providing jobs and also the research and development, all over within the Europe. You see, that was the kind of situation where when we had Japan-EU trade frictions, we needed the kind of local production to absorb the jobs in respective countries of EU member states, so that that was a way to mitigate the trade frictions between Japan and the European Union. Well, so those are the two pre-COVID-19 source of concerns, source of uncertainties. Now, I want to show you this diagram here, the corona effects. The global value chain has been very much disrupted. And this could be shown by index GSCPI. It's the global supply chain global supply chain pressure index. And this global supply chain pressure index has been produced on the basis of some 27 indices, including Baltic Maritime Shipment Index, and also the Procurement Managers Index and all that. So you see the maybe 1, 2, 3, 3 peaks, starting from the peaks around April 2011. That was following the earthquake, the Great Tohoku earthquake in Japan that took place in March 11th of 2011. And the GVC, a global value chain, has been largely disrupted by this huge earthquake and devastating tsunami following that earthquake. And then, the 2017, you see some sort of low peak there. That is the Mr. Trump's effect, and Mr. Trump's presidency went on to the year 2020. And you have the 2020 April, you have very high peak there. That's the starting of the corona, caused by the Delta type of coronavirus. And then we had some, sort of easing, curve coming down. But again, a very sharp rise because of this Omicron coronavirus. And now we have Ukraine warfare, and maybe even higher peak could be expected. So, the global value chain has been very much disrupted, particularly after corona, the COVID-19 pandemic has been spread all over the world. So you see, those are the 3 major sources of concern or uncertainties. First, the Trump-style protectionist approach, and then Brexit, and finally COVID-19 pandemic. Well, so the in the post-COVID-19 era, the trade concerns might be threefold. One is about economic security. All the countries now thinking about how to obtain this economic security. And particularly because of the semiconductor shortage, affected the production of auto industries, and also the rare metal scarcity, particularly now, in order to cope with zero emission vehicles, a lot of rare metal or the rare metal for batteries, for instance, very much important scarce resource. And, China is the main supplier of that, and that caused concern and the rest of the world. And also the tightened export control, resulting in short supply in importing countries. So those are the issues that all the countries are now try to tackle down in terms of economic security. Japan, for one, the present session of the Diet, Japanese Parliament, they're discussing about enacting law on economic security. In the United States, as you know, there's an entity list and 152 firms listed in relation to Huawei. And it contains some provisions of denied persons list or unverified list and so forth. The second important concern is carbon neutrality. The information disclosure via CDP. CDP stands for Carbon Disclosure Project, and some 9,600 companies disclosed in 2020. Reduction of GHG, greenhouse gas, carbon tax to prevent carbon leakage, and EU is now to introduce carbon tax, which caused a lot of contentious sort of discussions. And the EU wants to introduce this carbon tax system from the beginning of 2023, raising concerns elsewhere in relation to the WTO rules. So that's also the concern, one of the concerns that we have to follow. Then thirdly, human rights or labor standards. Those issues also becomes the very important agenda for trade. The linkage between human rights and the external economic policy is being established. And also that is somewhat a relation to Chinese case. The Uyghurs, the Muslim people in China, the Uyghurs have been systemically discriminated, and in some cases they're under strong pressure, and I don't know if it is correct to describe a kind of concentration camp where those Uyghur population have been put into, and they have the problems of human rights abuse by Chinese authorities. And some Japanese companies like Uniqlo, because allegedly they used the cotton fiber produced in Uyghur area. So that was subject to a prohibition of sale in European market or in the United States market and so forth. So the Uniqlo declared that they were no longer using the cotton fiber coming from that region of China. So you see, that's one example. So those issues like abuse of human rights, forced labor, slavery, child labor, harassment, those things will be subject to sanctions. So due diligence is very important matter due diligence to protect human rights that they have to take into consideration when they are engaged in the productions or in international trade. So those are the three concerns. It used to be non-trade concern, but there's no distinction between trade concerns and non-trade concerns, and those three issues have been now dealt with in order to have the international trade flow be smoothly flowing in the world. Okay, so that's a very long introduction on my own. And now I'd like to switch to how Japan has been constructing its trade architecture in the region of Asia Pacific first, and then beyond that region. And the keyword here is from de facto business-driven integration to de jure institution-driven integration. Starting from year 2001, it was the 21st century sort of endeavor on the part of Japan. First of all, I'd like to mention the de facto business-driven integration. And maybe best example can be shown by the Japanese car industry, the development of Japanese car industry, particularly after the Plaza Accord of September 1985. Plaza Accord in September 1985, that was the accord of G5 countries, the major industrialized countries, the 5 of them, and their central bankers and financial ministers get together in the Hotel Plaza of New York, and they discussed about the appreciation of Japanese yen. So the Japanese yen have been appreciated roughly 20 to 25%. After the Plaza Accord. So in order to mitigate the negative ramification of much appreciated Japanese yen, the Japanese companies, particularly those companies producing parts and components of auto industries, as well as parts and components producers of electric appliance companies, they started massively foreign direct investment. And their FDI went to the neighboring ASEAN countries such as Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and so forth. So you see the parts and components being produced in those neighboring ASEAN countries. Why? Because their national currencies had been pegged to US dollars, so that the up and downs of yen's value vis-a-vis United States will be neutralized because those national currencies of ASEAN have been pegged to United States, so they can avoid the negative ramification of appreciation of Japanese yen. So that was the kind of way out for the Japanese companies producing parts and components in auto industries or the electronics industries. The parts and components produced in Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, they have been traded quite actively. And also they, ASEAN themselves have been in the making of free trade agreement within ASEAN. So those parts and components production took advantage of the development of ASEAN free trade agreement. So you see, that was a kind of best sort of optimal supply system being established in East Asia. And that was the basis of what I would call de facto business-driven integration. But those companies, the Japanese auto companies or Japanese electric or electronic companies, they wanted to have more stability. So they asked the government to make legal instruments such as free trade agreement. Now we call that EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement. So that was the beginning of the discussions. So I would say the next slide I'm sharing with you. The Plaza Accord by G5 was an ignition key to start the de facto business-driven integration in East Asia. And that was through FDI, foreign direct investment, and resulting in the supply chain, development of supply chains, production networks in the region. And the companies wanted to have more sort of stability in that. So the governments, upon the request from the business sector, negotiated FTAs, EPAs to consolidate the merits of de facto integration. So slowly, the East Asia integration moving from de facto to de jure integration, and not only bilateral FTA, EPAs, but also the going beyond bilateral deals. And for instance, ASEAN plus one type of FTA, ASEAN plus one, by that we mean ASEAN plus China, ASEAN plus Korea, of course, ASEAN plus Japan, ASEAN plus Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. And we have 5 different types of ASEAN plus one. And discussion went beyond ASEAN plus three. By that we mean Japan, China, Korea, and ASEAN plus 6, adding 3 more countries like Australia, New Zealand, and India. And actually, ASEAN plus 6 resulted in the RCEP. RCEP stands for Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And finally, the RCEP came into existence as of 1st January this year. But unfortunately, I should say that India stepped out from RCEP. So instead of 16 countries, but 15 countries created this RCEP. So that's the one of the major mega FTA in the region of East Asia. We have also discussion on trilateral EPA comprising Japan, China, Korea as well. Okay, so beyond bilateral FTA EPAs, beyond regional FTA EPAs, now we have TPP as an inter-regional FTA. But after US departure, we had that CPTPP, comprehensive and progressive TPP. So CPTPP, or otherwise we call TPP 11, without the United States, to keep momentum of trade liberalism in the aftermath of US departure from the TPP in force since December 2018. So that's the development in East Asia and beyond. Let me briefly explain the basic characteristics of Economic Partnership Agreement of Japan. It's Japan's FTA strategy, but FTA in a traditional sense, that's a market access, duty elimination on goods, as well as liberalization in regulations, controlling services. So that's the market access, both in goods and services. That's a core part of EPA. But in addition to this core part, we have government procurement, the chapter on government procurement, and chapter on movement of natural persons, the chapter on competition policies, chapter on business environment, also another chapter on bilateral cooperation, and maybe most importantly, chapter on investment. So altogether, about 20 chapters comprising one EPA. So the next slide indicating the the composition of the substance of Japan's EPA. in each of those bilateral EPAs with our partner countries. So this is a list of Japan's EPA, starting from Japan, Singapore FTA. That was the first FTA negotiation, but Singapore is a free port, and their duty is very low, and Japan's duty is also very low, with the exception of agriculture duties. So that was a very important sort of exercise to begin with the FTA negotiations. But the real challenge came to Japan when we started EPA negotiation with Mexico, because Mexico's export, 20% of Mexican export to Japan was on agriculture. And we have to accommodate Mexican request to increase their agriculture product, particularly their pork. The pork was half of Mexican agriculture export. So Mexico put priority in expanding their pork market in Japan. So on Japanese side, agriculture was really the sensitive, and particularly the meat was one of the sensitive areas. Most sensitive area that was rice, but pork was quite sensitive because more than 50% of pork consumption in Japan is already fulfilled by foreign suppliers such as United States, Canada, and Denmark. So the Japanese pork producers have been already exposed to very harsh competition. Therefore, there was a very strong resistance against the inclusion of pork into the trade deal between Japan and Mexico. So you can imagine all kinds of manifestations, anti-EPA, anti-FTA demonstrations by agriculture cooperatives and so forth. So we have to face with this kind of domestic political difficulties in promoting EPA. Well, it took 23 months to conclude the agreement in substance. That was good experience for Japan because in this way, I mean, in the negotiation with Mexico, Japan prepared a kind of stereotype compromise system to accommodate sensitive agriculture products. In the case of Mexico, that was pork. But in the case of Australia, for instance, that was beef. Beef was also quite sensitive product. So in the case of pork and in the case of pork or in the case of beef, Japan managed to agree with the exporters such as Mexico and Australia in creating what we call the preferential duty quota. You see, preferential duty quota. We provided the Mexico the certain amount of pork export, which would be applicable to preferential duty rates, which is significantly lower than MFN duty rates. So in this way, this Mexican method worked out also in the case of Australian beef, and also some other difficult issues involved in the TPP agricultural negotiations. Anyway, so we have a number of bilateral EPAs with mainly with ASEAN countries, one by one. And then we have also comprehensive Japan-ASEAN economic partnership agreement. We have Japan-EU agreement. That was also came into effect in 2019. We have trade in goods agreement with the United States. And we have also bilateral EPA with the UK after UK exited from European Union. Now UK is interested in getting into TPP, and they might be the first one to join the TPP 11. Well, so this is a list of Japanese EPAs, bilateral ones. Just to briefly touch upon the very characteristics of TPP. There was the original TPP agreed in Atlanta in October 2015, and the very characteristic of TPP is a very high tariff elimination ratio. It's almost 100% on industrial products, and even for agriculture is very high, 97.1% would be subject to duty elimination. The rules part is also very significant in TPP. SOE stands for state-owned enterprises, and the SOE's regulation on non-commercial assistance by government will be under certain disciplines. SOEs, when the TPP countries are negotiating, that included the United States, the socialist economy country among the participants of TPP negotiation, that was Vietnam. But the negotiators had in their mind, they had China in their mind. So SOEs, essentially being negotiated, having China in the mind of negotiators. So SOE is not only for Vietnam, but rather it anticipated future Chinese participation in the TPP. Other issues such as labor and the environment is also very high standard, and is also subject to dispute settlement procedures. That is very important. Government procurement also, try to extend the obligations similar to the WTO GPA, government procurement agreement. And user-friendly rules like rules of origin, and try to make generous rules of origin so that rules of origin will not stand against freer flow of goods within the territories of TPP member countries. Trade facilitation and SME, small and medium-sized enterprises, related provisions. Investment had dispute settlement rule called ISDS, investor versus state dispute settlement. That means that investor can sue the state, the government of hosting country of that investment. Quite, progressive and well advanced content of rules being successfully negotiated in the TPP. Other countries like Korea, Philippines, Thailand, Taiwan, Indonesia, United Kingdom, and so forth, that also indicated its interest. And at a certain point, Colombia also indicated its interest of joining. I hope it will be the case for the CPTPP. What was the kind of preoccupation if the United States withdrew from the TPP? China would certainly take advantage of US withdrawal from rulemaking in trade and investment across Asia Pacific by imposing its own power-oriented trade policies. Aggressive use of anti-dumping measures, huge state subsidies on steel. Those are the issues that we have to deal with in the region of Asia Pacific. Also, China will lose incentives to enhance FTAs such as RCEP and JCK in the absence of the TPP, jeopardizing further trade liberalization in the region of Asia Pacific. Also, One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road initiatives would be further enhanced and by making full use of the AIIB. AIIB is Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is established by China. So those are the concerns, and that will result in the major crisis for the free democracy in the region of Asia Pacific. And those concerns have been very much at the source, at the heart of other 11 remaining countries of TPP. And Japan took initiative to consolidate the negotiated results of the TPP, original TPP, and try to create TPP 11, that's CPTPP, and that is to pursue a template of 21st century trade rules across Asia Pacific to keep momentum that has been created by original TPP. Japan and Colombia, let's talk about it. I have got 6 chat communications. I don't know if it's related to, okay, all right. So now let us talk about Japan and Colombia towards more strengthened partnership. And of course, the basic objective is to explore untapped potentiality between the two countries. Yes, let me move on. Yes, Colombia is a very attractive country, and we have to, I think, on our part, Japan should exploit further what we could do to make Colombia closer to us. How does Japan look at this major power in Latin America? First of all, the Colombia's geopolitical position, there is a geopolitical merit, pivotal position between the Pacific and the Atlantic, link point between North and Central America on one hand and South America on the other. And also population is also quite attractive, 3rd largest population in Latin America, big market of 50 million people, and labor force is very young and qualified, and middle class is growing. Those are very healthy signs. And also, thirdly, Colombia is rich in natural resource. You have petroleum and coal, ferro-nickel, gold and emerald, and those precious stones, metals. Political and economic stability. The peace agreement 2016 is the kind of platform for this political and economic stability. Stable government with open economy, democracy, particularly under President Duque, and sustained budgetary principle. Also in the trade agreements, trade policies, Colombia seems to be very ambitious country with 16 countries and regions. Colombia has FTAs. Then the good business environment is also the attraction for foreign investment. The OECD membership has been sought since 2018. The bilateral investment agreement with Japan be already into effect since September 2015. So all these reasons, I think we have to further develop our bilateral relations in order to realize the untapped potentiality that I have just mentioned. There's a very short chronology of recent years. Japan-Colombia bilateral relations. I think we have already BIA, as I mentioned, since 2015, tax treaty signed in December 2018. Japan for Colombia. It is the 17th as exporting partners, but I think I have some updates in that regard. Let me check. Yes. Well, there is a positive movement and also kind of negative movement. Now, Japan for Colombia, Japan is 27th in ranking in terms of export and 33 in ranking in import in 2020, according to IMF statistics. And for Japan, Colombia is 43rd as exporting partner and 63 in terms of importing partner. So obviously, we have to work, both sides have to work harder to increase either side presence in respective market, either in Japan or in Colombia. Japanese companies in Colombia, also I have some update here. I think there was 100 Japanese companies in 2018, but now it's been reduced to 83 in the year 2021. Maybe there is a COVID-19 effect to explain this decrease of the number of Japanese companies. Okay. Now let's move on. How does Japan deal with those uncertainties? A proactive approach towards more integrated open market across Asia Pacific. I mentioned about the RCEP. RCEP is a very new endeavor that just came into existence, just came into effect as of January the 1st, 2022, this year. And this is to bring 15 countries, 10 of ASEAN nations, and ASEAN plus 3, JCK, Japan, China, Korea, plus Australia and New Zealand. That makes 15 in total. So you see, this is integration of supply chain networks in East Asia. You see, looking at this slide, example one, Japanese automotive company based in Thailand imports engines and transmissions from Japan, assemble them in Thailand and exports from Thailand to Australia. That is a typical sort of pattern of production networking in this region. Example three, It's about the elevator. A Japanese elevator manufacturer based in Thailand imports hoist from China, manufactures elevator in Thailand and export it to India, you see. That is also the typical example of supply chain here. And the RCEP will be very instrumental in making those regulations such as rules of origin much simple to facilitate the use by the stakeholders. So the rules of origin has been much simplified, and the same kind of uniformed regulation being applicable to the transactions, so that the transaction cost can be reduced by virtue of applying this RCEP agreement. So this is the membership of RCEP, 15 countries, 10 of ASEAN nations, Japan, China, Korea, plus Australia, New Zealand, just in the middle, and hope that India will come back. But India, why India dropped out from this RCEP architecture? Because they are very much afraid of Chinese product flooding into India after duties have been eliminated. So India wanted to keep relatively high duties on the products. So they wanted to step down from the agreement. If you look at this slide, you will notice that 7 countries of RCEP, out of 15 RCEP member countries, 7 of them, including Japan, are the members to CPTPP. So there is overlapping membership, and that is very important element. You see, the TPP is much well advanced in terms of both in market access and also rule making. TPP is more advanced than RCEP. Their negotiating agenda, from trading goods, trading services, all kinds of rules like the technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary issues, they are almost identical, even including the e-commerce and competition policy, the government procurement, and so forth. But the I would say the RCEP is much shallower, while TPP is much deeper. And TPP rules are much more advanced and stringent, I would say. So you see, in this way, those 4 countries, the 7 countries in TPP, they have the double membership both to RCEP and TPP. Those 7 countries would be kind of playing the role of intermediary for those countries which are not yet members to CPTPP. Slowly, there would be more and more the members coming into CPTPP. Already China has made formal request to become member to CPTPP, and Korea is also the case. So perhaps, in due course, more RCEP members will join CPTPP. So CPTPP will be kind of final model of 21st century trade rules in the region of Asia Pacific. Right. So you know, in case of Japan, Japan could play a very important role there. And Japan, for one, enjoys double membership to RCEP and also TPP. And, I think, you know, the people in Colombia are very familiar with baseball. And in the US baseball, you have major league and minor league. And I'd like to use a metaphor of baseball here. RCEP could be considered as minor league. And in the minor league, younger players do a lot of exercise. And once they are, much better in playing baseball, and they have all the, techniques, and when they are ready, they would be transferred to major league from minor league. And TPP is like major league. So those countries who are in RCEP, they would implement what they have agreed in the negotiations. And in this way, little by little, they used to exercise the trade rules in RCEP, and once they are ready, they could challenge, they can just knock at the door of TPP. There's a kind of sequential sort of step-by-step sort of structure there. And in the future, many RCEP countries will join TPP and try to help those countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar to prepare themselves to become members to CPTPP one day. You see, and finally, in East Asia, the countries are thinking of free trade area of Asia Pacific, FTAAP, which is under consideration in the APEC. APEC is Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation since 1989. Every year we had this summit meeting and trade ministers meeting and all the relevant ministers meeting under the framework of APEC. So APEC is considering having free trade area of Asia Pacific. So I think it is a way to approach the two major pillars. One is CPTPP and the other is RCEP, but they are not conflictual. They are more, complementary, and also they could be kind of sequential approach. Those countries are already, ready in taking higher standard, then they can try CPTPP, graduating from RCEP, so to speak, you see. And we should not forget the multilateral structure. We have EU, we have now NAFTA, which is now changed to USMCA, but a lot of NAFTA elements still valid. We have Mercosur, we have Alianza del Pacifico, where Colombia is also associated with. And in East Asia, we have RCEP. And between the regions, between Asia and Americas, we have TPP. Between Europe and East Asia, we have Japan, EU, EPA. So in this way, we are making WTO more strengthened. The Doha agenda has been a failure. So kind of top-down approach will not be effective in the present circumstances, but from maybe bottom-up approach. You see, in the TPP or Japan EU or RCEP, we have those issues that we failed in bringing up in the Doha agenda, such as trade and investment, trade and competition policy, trade and environment, labor standard issues. Those have been rejected by the developing countries. But there is a significant core group, or what I would call the critical mass, has been in progress. TPP as well as RCEP, we had 20 chapters, and in those chapters we agreed on, say, competition policies, investment issues, e-commerce, all those new issues been already stipulated in the CPTPP or RCEP or Japan-EU EPA. So perhaps what we can do is bring back all those new issues back to WTO track, you see. So next time in the WTO negotiations, we would have more like-minded countries. Like-minded countries already involved in the TPP, already involved in the RCEP, already involved in Japan, EU, and so forth. So in this way, we can pave the way more smoothly to bring in the new issues such as e-commerce, such as state-owned enterprises, trade and competition, trade and investment into the WTO edifice of multilateral trading system. So concluding remarks. From Japanese perspective, TPP 12, the original TPP would remain as a template for 21st century type trade agreement. TPP 11 is to keep momentum for the freer trade in Asia Pacific. RCEP or JCK FTA for updating the production network in East Asia. Japan-EU EPA, the major inter-regional mega FTA connecting East Asia and the EU via Japan. Japan-Mercosur EPA, that's also something that we should take into consideration to further explore as a subsequent policy agenda. Japan-Colombia Economic Partnership Agreement, we should accelerate and should be concluded without any further delay. So this is a way to keep trade multilateralism relevant and alive, and thus to maintain predictability in international business. So the key word here is multilateralizing regionalism. We have a lot of regional integrations. I mentioned that as a kind of possible threat to multilateralism, but we could multilateralize those regional frameworks. Mention 3 mega FTAs like TPP, TTIP, Japan-EU EPA, RCEP, of course, and new momentum to reinforce the trade multilateralism embodied in the WTO, the rulemaking in the digital trade, e-commerce, cooperation in the WTO reform discussions. That is still possible on the basis of critical mass, more like-minded countries participating in that discussions. Japan and Colombia should work together to strengthen the WTO. So this is the end of my presentation. Sorry for rather long presentation, and hope that it has been useful to you. And I'd like to invite Professor Matsui, Dr. Matsui, to comment on this expose. Well, thank you very much indeed.
Excelente, profesor. Muchas gracias por el recorrido que ha hecho, por todos los antecedentes que hoy nos ha traído. De manera particular lo he disfrutado mucho. Y bueno, recuerden que vamos a tener una sesión de preguntas y respuestas después de la presentación del profesor Matsui. Las pueden ir dejando en el chat y trataremos en lo posible de responderlas dependiendo del tiempo que tengamos. Vamos ahora entonces con el profesor Matsui, que nos dará a conocer sus comentarios sobre la integración regional de América Latina y el panorama de la historia de la integración y la tendencia del cambio hacia Asia. Entonces, profesor Matsui, adelante y muchas gracias por acompañarnos.
Professor Watanabe, could you shut down your PowerPoint?
Oh, yes, sure. Okay. Right. Okay, now you have the control.
Okay. Okay, can you see the slide of my presentation? Okay.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so let me start my presentation. The purpose of my presentation is to highlight several important points from the Latin American viewpoints. And my presentation is very brief and my message is very simple. So these are the contents of my presentation. In first part, I would like to overview the character of regional integration framework. The important framework in this region is, as you know, the NAFTA and Mercosur. And then I'd like to talk about the new trends in 2010s. The keyword in new trend is shift toward Asia and the polarization in Latin America. These are two keywords that you should keep in mind. And the last part 3, I'd like to talk about the future trend of regional integration framework. And in this context, I'd like to review some data, GDP growth data and trade data. And finally, I'd like to provide you some several points for discussion. So now I'd like to talk about the part 1. As you can see, I'd like to take up 3 early stage framework. The first one is the framework for Central America. The next is Andean countries, and the third is the Caribbean countries. I call these 3 frameworks the early stage framework because it was formed in 1960s and 1970s. And after that, as you know, in Latin America, we have seen stagnation in 1980s. Politically, we've seen the spread of Cold War to Central America, and also data accumulation problems are very serious. And we often call it a lost decade. But after that, we have seen the drastic change in 1990s. As a symbol of the drastic change, we can see the formation of NAFTA and Mercosur. And the character of these frameworks are very, very different. As for the early stage framework, the character is important substitution and protective measures. And I call this inward tendency. But the character of the NAFTA and Mercosur is completely different. The character is trade liberalization and economic reform. So I call it onward tendency. So the character of framework is completely different. So this is the first important point of my presentation. This diagram shows what I've said now. You can see in the diagram, you can see the big size of NAFTA and Mercosur. And you can see that in NAFTA, Mexico is, after the formation of NAFTA, the economy of Mexico is completely integrated to NAFTA. So in this context, in this sense, I can say that the formation of NAFTA is a successful example. But the case of Mercosur is a little bit different. So now I'd like to talk about the history of Mercosur. As you know, the Mercosur was formed in early 1990s. And the background of Mercosur is what we call Washington Consensus. Washington Consensus is characterized as a neoliberalism policy using market mechanism. And as a result of Washington Consensus, we've seen economic reform of two major economies, Brazil and Argentina. And these two countries have successfully controlled hyperinflation. And as a result, we've seen the inflow of capital to the region in the form of privatization and bond, in the form of these are what I call a virtuous circle. So in 1990s, we've seen the success of Mercosur, but the situation has dramatically changed in the early 2000s. We've seen the economic confusion of Argentina, collapse of currency bond system, and debt crisis. So as a result, we've seen the capital flight from the region. So I call this vicious circle of Mercosur. So maybe you know that the Mercosur was we had a lot of expectation to Mercosur, but the situation has changed and the expectation hasn't realized. That's my analysis of two major framework of Latin American region. And then I'd like to talk about the new trends in the 2010s. As I have said, I have two important keywords. The first important keyword is shift toward Asia. And the other important keyword is the polarization of the region. Firstly, I'd like to talk about the polarization. By polarization, I mean the nation is, the region is divided in two regions. The one pole is the Pacific Alliance. The other pole is the Mercosur. Maybe you can understand what I've said in this map. As you can see, most Pacific Alliance countries face the Pacific Ocean, but the Mercosur is different. So it may be oversimplifying the situation, but I can see that Latin America is divided in two groups. The group of Pacific Alliance in the group of Mercosur. The character of the Pacific Alliance is outward tendency. As I've said, that the character of NAFTA and Mercosur was an outward tendency, but now the character of Mercosur was changed, and now the Pacific Alliance has the tendency of outward tendency. On the other hand, the character of Mercosur was changed into inward tendency. And that's my analysis of the trend in 2010s. The second feature of important trend in 2010 is a shift toward Asia. As you know, we've seen in Latin America, we've seen the increasing trade with Asia in 2000. And in this context, the relationship of Asia and Latin America has become a completely complementary relationship. Especially China, the important factor. China wants to secure resources for growing economy from 2000s. On the other hand, for Latin America, the Asia was a very attractive region because Asia has been rapidly growing. So in this context, I can say that the relationship was very complementary. And as for the TPP participation issue, I can say that the following factors are important. Of course, as you know, the TPP participation means the enlargement of FTA strategy. And also the TPP negotiation for participation means the policy stability effect. Once you have participated in TPP framework, you cannot easily change the framework. So that's what I mean by policy stability effect. And also, I call this also quit and lock-in effect. I think these are the important effects brought by the TPP participation negotiation. And finally, I'd like to talk about the several important points for discussion. And before that, I'd like to a little bit talk about the statistics. You can see the GDP growth data. This data is for 2014 data. You can see that red highlighted country in Latin America is Venezuela. And the orange highlighted country is Argentina. So that means the performance of Venezuela and Argentina was very bad. So you can see that this is a kind of a symbol of inward tendency of Mercosur. This symbolizes the inward tendency economic stagnation of Mercosur countries. Then also I'd like to talk about the GDP growth rate. This graph shows the trend of GDP growth rate. You can see that, of course, the GDP growth rate of emerging countries are very high, red line. And on the other hand, the growth rate of advanced economy is very low, blue line. The average is yellow one. But of course, there are differences of level of growth rate. But you can see the clear synchronization of growth rate in world economy. That's the important feature of this diagram. Then this is the exposed to diversification index of world countries. In this map, you can see that Venezuela is red. The red means is that economy is not diversified. As you know that Venezuela is completely independent of oil exports. So that's the reason why the color of Venezuela is red. For other countries, for example, Colombia, the color of Colombia is yellow. So So that means the diversification of Colombia is the average level in this Latin American region. These are the feature of export diversification index. In the last data is trade data. This graph shows the export of Colombia to world countries. As you see, the top export partner is the United States. Then comes China, and then comes Ecuador, Panama, and Brazil. So that means that for neighbor countries of Colombia. And as for the Asian countries, you can find the only India except China. Then I turn to the import data. As you can see that import of Colombia heavily concentrated on two countries, I mean United States and China. Then come to Mexico and Brazil, so that means from neighbor countries. And as for Asian countries, we can find India and Japan, except China. So these are the data of trade of Colombia. And my last comment, I mean, the slide that shows the points for discussion to the participants. The first point I want to point out is the synchronization of the world economy. The more integrated in the world economy, the more the economy becomes volatile and affected by external factors. So this is kind of a dilemma. So if we have time, maybe I'd like to hear from participants what you think of this dilemma. The second point is the restructure of the global supply chain. Since the second half of 2010s, global supply chain has been undergoing structural changes. So maybe I'd like to know what's the position of Colombia will be in this trend. I mean, the Colombia will be face a dilemma or not, or I'm not sure. Anyway, this is the second point. The last point is the growing presence of China. China has become virtually the first-rate partner of our Latin American region. So, especially I'd like to hear from participants what you think of this factor, I mean China factor in this region. So maybe I'd like to conclude my presentation with this slide. Thank you for listening to my very presentation. Thank you very much.
Profesor Matsui, muchas gracias por su excelente presentación. Los puntos que usted ha dejado de discusión son todos muy interesantes y muy amplios. Lamentablemente por tiempo, pues solamente vamos a dar opción a algunas personas para que hagan su pregunta, ¿no? Entonces voy a leer las preguntas. Voy a escoger así al azar 3 preguntas, 2 para el profesor Watanabe y una para el profesor Matsui. Entonces voy a ir con la primera pregunta para el profesor Watanabe, agradeciéndole, profesor, una respuesta corta, considerando que solo nos quedan 10 minutos para 3 preguntas. Entonces voy a respetar la primera persona que lanzó una pregunta, el señor Juan Franco, que dice, las grandes empresas y multinacionales japonesas son la punta de lanza para incursionar en el mercado mundial. En Japón, ¿qué estrategias emplean para estimular e impulsar a sus empresas de menor tamaño, micro, pequeña y mediana empresa, para que se revitalicen, integren y beneficien, por ejemplo, en cadenas de proveeduría a sus grandes empresas o para que participen directamente en los mercados globales? Adelante, profesor Watanabe.
Thank you very much for the question regarding the SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. Yes, it is true that the major beneficiaries of those trade agreements like TPP or RCEP or all individual bilateral EPAs, economic partnership agreements, the major beneficiaries are the large companies. The small and the medium-sized companies, they are quite often subcontractors to the big companies, and they don't feel much benefits of using those EPAs or trade agreements. So currently in Japan, we give priority to provide the more information and more training to take advantage of existing economic partnership agreements or trade agreements and try to make the rules more simple to be used for the small and medium-sized enterprises. In that regard, for instance, in the case of TPP and RCEP, for the rules of origin, the sort of self-declaration approach has been adopted. Rather than asking Chamber of Commerce or any other institutions to provide the certificate of origins, the companies, they can just declare themselves whether they are eligible to rules of origin. And that is already the first step to be taken. So the Japanese organizations such as JETRO, Japan External Trade Organizations, as well as the Chamber of Commerce and Industry, they are helping, they are assisting the SMEs to develop their own trade strategies on the basis of those FTAs, EPAs available to them. Thank you.
Perfecto, profesor, muchas gracias. Voy ahora con el profesor Matsui. Entonces, la pregunta dice, ¿qué elementos debe mejorar la Alianza del Pacífico y Mercosur en la negociación de tratados con Asia, especialmente Colombia con su relación con Asia? Adelante, profesor Matsui.
Thank you very much. The question is a very, very sharp and difficult one for me to answer. But so it's not easy to generalize the elements that you should keep in mind. But I'd like to say that we should, Colombia should concretely consider measures to increase export to Asian countries, and concrete measures for expanding exports, like the, for example, I think there are some rooms for your country to increase export to India. So maybe you have a lot of trade connections with, already a lot of trade connections with China. But as for India, it seems to me that there are a lot of room for improvement, export expansion for Colombia. So I'm sorry that I can't answer your question, but maybe I think what's important is the concrete measure for increasing export to individual countries. That's my answer.
Ok, perfecto, profesor. Muchas gracias. Y voy con una última pregunta, presentando nuevamente excusas a todas aquellas personas que hicieron algún interrogante, pero entiéndanos que por tiempo debemos respetar. Entonces, la pregunta dice, ¿cuáles son las preocupaciones, para el profesor Watanabe, cuáles son las preocupaciones comerciales y no comerciales de la nueva era de la economía digital y qué riesgos representan para una integración real del sector de servicios en la región de Asia-Pacífico? Adelante, profesor Watanabe.
Okay, thank you very much for the question about the digital economy. Yes, digital economy is really the important issue at stake, both in the RCEP and CPTPP. There is a chapter on e-commerce, but if you look at the content of CPTPP and the content in RCEP in regard of e-commerce, the stipulation is quite different. CPTPP is quite advanced and deeper, whereas RCEP is much shallower and limited applications. For instance, in the case of e-commerce, in TPP, we have three principles. One is free data flow. Free data flow, that's number one. Number two, the prohibition of data localization requirement, that's number two. Number three is prohibition of requirement to disclosure the source code. So in terms of those three principles that has been perfectly stipulated in the TPP, RCEP could afford only the first two, namely the data flow, free data flow, and prohibition of data localization. But as regard of prohibition of requirement for the source code disclosure, the negotiation was very difficult and somewhat, fell short of agreeing, and there's no stipulation or prohibition of requirement of source code disclosure. And also, basically in the CPTPP, all those e-commerce issues would be subject to dispute settlement, whereas in RCEP, dispute settlement is, out of scope. So they are going to continue the discussion about the possibility of bringing in the data issues into RCEP, but nobody knows when, you see. They say 5 years, but there's no formal commitment in that. So in that sense, yes, because RCEP, you have a lot of developing countries, like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar. They have dispensation of over 5 years after coming into force this RCEP agreement. So we have much, behind developing countries like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar on one hand, and we have strong growing China, which does not want to have dispute settlement in this area. They don't want to have the prohibition of disclosure requirement of source code. They want to have that, you see. So that's the future possibility, but at the same time, that's a present preoccupation on our part, on the part of Japan, for instance. So Japan is certainly trying to push forward the TPP 3 principles, free data flow, data localization prohibition, requirement of source code disclosure. And the third point, the
Bueno, creo que ya terminó su respuesta. Ah, no, tiene problemas de internet. Bueno, en aras de respetar el tiempo de todos ustedes que nos han acompañado, pues nuestros agradecimientos. Saben que este fue un evento de manera particular realizado entre la Embajada del Japón, el Centro del Japón y la Cámara Colombo-Japonesa. También tuvimos el respaldo de la Cancillería colombiana. Entonces, solo me queda tomarme un minuto más para agradecerles a los más de 120 asistentes que nos acompañaron. Vi personas en Colombia de varias ciudades, entre ellas de Bogotá, de Medellín, de Cali. Vi algunas personas desde Japón. Tuvimos un par desde Europa y varios desde Latinoamérica. Pues a todos ellos muchas, muchas gracias. El profesor Watanabe, nuestro sincero voz de cariño y de aprecio por acompañarnos nuevamente en esta ocasión. Igual al profesor Matsui, interesante su exposición y esperamos tenerlo próximamente en otros eventos similares. Al señor consejero Kodama de la Embajada del Japón, agradecerle también por su participación. A Jean-Marie Chenou de la Universidad de los Andes, muchas gracias. Y a Mari Asano y a su equipo de trabajo del Centro del Japón. De manera general, reitero mis agradecimientos a la Embajada del Japón en Colombia, a la Universidad de los Andes, al Centro del Japón, y les reitero, el material que va a incluir una entrevista que hicimos hace unos días con el profesor Watanabe, va a estar a disposición de ustedes, conjuntamente con las presentaciones. Pues a todos les deseo excelente día en Colombia, muy buenas noches en Japón, gracias por acompañarnos, sabemos que es muy tarde allá, y a las personas de las otras latitudes, muchas, muchas gracias. Entonces, que tengan un feliz día y nos estaremos encontrando próximamente. Muchas gracias a todos y éxitos. Hasta luego.